Ahojte milí tretiaci, vítam vás na ďalšej hodine, ktorú som zase nahral dopredu kvôli stále neistým Wi-Fi, ktoré tu máme. My dnes začneme novú tému, ktorá v podstate začína pre nás touto bitkou, ktorej pekné video animované ako keby z hry Medieval Total War, práve v maďarčine, ale to som našiel s anglickými titulkami. Battle of Moháč. Moháčská bitka určila to, čo bude, možno máme ešte raz pustiť, keď budeme Habsburskú monarchiu preberať, tak to, čo nám tvorí medzník medzi stredovekom a novovekom. V angličtine tieto udalosti budeme nazývať modern period, moderná doba, pretože v tomto období renesancie a humanizmu v podstate to vnímali už ako nové obdobie, niečo nové, nejaké nové veci, ktoré prichádzajú. A okrem tejto moháčskej bitky bolo zopár tých míľnikov, my sme ich samozrejme už predtým preberali, pri tom úvode do stredoveku, no a budeme si ich spomínať aj v niekoľkých témach, ktoré budete vy spracovať teraz. Samozrejme pôjdeme po anglicky, takže aj tento maďarský text, ktorý inak by bol fajn, kebyže to je aj v slovenčine, chorvačine, rumunčine, pretože naozaj veľmi dobre spracované. No a v podstate celá tá bitka je tu krásne zanimovaná. Určite lepšie, keď sú naši ako Turci natočili, kde v podstate bitky pri Mohači dali o 150 rokov neskôršie oblečenie a tak, takže na to si treba tiež dať pozor. No dobre, my toto však nebudeme riešiť. Ja vám na tejto hodine samozrejme nezabudnite otázky zodpovedať, ktoré máte pod týmto linkom, ktorý som vám teda zavesil tak ako minule. No a ja vám zavesím aj do files ďalšiu, pozerám, áno, ešte nemám. Takže ja vám zavesím aj ďalšie zadanie, ktoré budete mať teda robiť. Dnes ste včera, respektíve v nedeľu, posielali vaše testy. Takže ja ich čítam, myslím, že väčšine z vás som už aj rýchlo odpovedal a dostali ste, dúfam, že pekné jednotky. Tento raz to bude trošku viac, bude to trochu viac, ale oproti tým druháckym budú niečo odlišné. No. V podstate celá táto téma sa volá Early Modern Period, čiže ranný novovek, pretože ten vrcholný alebo High Modern Period považujeme hlavne 19. storočie a Late Modern Period je to vlastne teraz, že ako neskorý novovek. Čiže zobrali sme si také podobné veci, ako boli pri stredoveku. Takže čo tu máme? No, my v tomto rannom novoveku sa budeme venovať tým udalostiam od dobytia Carihradu, či otázka osmanských Turkov, preto Ottoman Conquest alebo Ottoman Empire, a to začne dnes. Myslím, že prebehnem aj rýchlo a hneď pôjdem na ďalšiu dôležitú vec, ktorá výrazne zmenila udalosti, a to bol Humanism and Renaissance, obdobie humanizmu a renesancie. Je to podľa starej prezentácie, ktorú som si požičal od nejakého asi amerického učiteľky, nás som trošku upravil. Čiže to, čo vy budete zadaní robiť, bude trošku lepšie. No a potom budú dve veľké témy, ktoré sú naozaj super a veľmi dôležité. A to budú Age of Discoveries. Poznámky, ktoré máte, som doplnil a upravil a budete to mať ako prezentáciu, čiže o dosť viacej vizuálu. Nejaké videjka tam budú a tak, čiže stačí sledovať. No a napokon veľká prezentácia, jedna z najväčších, čo mám, o reformácii, Reformation and Religious Conflicts. Tam je množstvo konfliktov, vojen a udalostí, ktoré výrazne zmenia najmä západnú Európu, spôsobia obrovské konflikty, na tú dobu aj najväčší, ktorý budeme končiť, je to 30-ročná vojna. Čo teda máte robiť v tom detská zadaní? V podstate nič iné, nemusíte ani hľadať, ale aspoň pri väčšine nemusíte hľadať. Stačí vám dobre sledovať hodiny, ktoré bude mať. A ja budem na veľa vecí odpovedať, alebo to zadanie bude v podstate priamo sa dať vyplniť počas tej hodiny, ako budete sledovať. Hneď prvé bude Right Contributions of Three Most Ottoman Sultans, Most Famous Ottoman Sultans. Ja ich budem tých troch spomínať, hneď si napíšete meno a napíšete nejaké kľúčové slova. Conquered this, he sees this, he reformed this, and so on. No samozrejme budú tam tieto mapky, platí to isté, prosím, ale že ak si nemáte kde tlačiť, tak vy si to môžete vypracovať, niektorí z vás to tak aj spravili, ale tú mapku treba potom samozrejme prekresliť približne v tých obrysoch, čiže si to otvorte a skúste naznačiť. Tuto konkrétne budete zaznačovať hranice, teda vyplňať ealety, čiže územné celky Osmanskej ríše, contemporary states, súčasné krajiny, čiže dobre možno nejakou ceruskou alebo perom alebo niečím iným zaznačiť hranice súčasných štátov, že ktoré tie ealety kde zasahovali. Tu napríklad sme Slovensko v tejto časti približne. No a máte tam nejaké ďalšie otázky k vojnám a bitkám, pretože bolo to také vojnové. No toto máte hľadať, toto bude veľmi pekné, rôzne knižky, treba sa popýtať. A myslím, že mnoho z vás bude mať doma, nebudete vedieť rôzne povesti, rozprávky, ktoré sa aj venujú týmto udalostiam a sú v podstate o rôznych veciach. Na internete určite toho nájdete. Samozrejme budú niekedy také že Read Juraj Červenák book series about Captain Batory. Dobrodružstvo kapitán Batory samozrejme nemusíte čítať, je to skôr také motivačné pre vás, čiže túto úlohu konkrétne nemusíte napríklad splniť. Humanizmus a renesancia, tu v podstate všetko vám zodpoviem, niektoré veci si musíte ešte dohľadať, ale myslím, že to bude úplne pohodová parádna vec, lebo viem, že tá gotika napríklad vás celkom bavila. No a toto bude vec, kde na jednom sláde máte množstvo renesančných umelcov, humanistických a filozofov alebo učencov. Takže ja som vám doplnil ešte zo pár z nich, no a máte o nich nájsť nejaké veci, čiže characteristics, čiže nejakú základnú charakteristiku, čiže kto to boli, z akej krajiny boli, čím sa živili a možno nejaké známe dielo, publikáciu, maľbu, sochu, vyberte nejaké, čo vy viete, že bolo zaujímavé, alebo že je to slávne napríklad. No a máte Slovensko vybrať z Európy, čiže tu budete hľadať, ale myslím, že je to úplná pohodička. No Age of Discoveries, zámorské objavy, alebo Age of Exploration sa ešte táto téma volá. A zdal Discoveries, pretože je tam veľa vecí, ktoré nemuseli vymyslieť, objaviť, zistiť, aby oni mohli aj skúmať, explore. Takže v podstate pôjdete len podľa týchto textov. Toto bola strašná úloha minulý rok pre mnohých. Ja som vám preto tam dal jedno také videjko, ktoré ani nie tak hranice ukazuje, ale vývoj jazyka, španielského a portugalského jazyka v tomto období. Takže môže vám to dať nejaký hint, nejaký návod, že ako to spracovať. No a potom v podstate len spravíte tabuľky, časovú os a tak ďalej. Môžete to samozrejme zväčšiť, upraviť, rôzne krajiny a tak ďalej. No túto mapku môžete dať na podstatne väčší formát, aby ste s ním mohli pracovať. Tu vám povolím na tejto mape pracovať aj v IT, ak máte svoje vlastné, ale nie je možné, aby ste skopírovali nejakú mapu a hodili. Musí byť presne v určených farbách, ktoré tu sú pre jednotlivé krajiny, čiže kopírovať sa tu ani nedá, keď to zbadám, nie je to zlé. No a Reformation, tak máte v podstate také trojkové úlohy, ktoré rovno spoznám z hodiny môžete si odpisovať. Takisto 10 Various Names of Calvinist Denominations. No, takisto film Kráľovná Margot, Queen Margot, nemusíte pozerať samozrejme, tam nemáte žiadnu úlohu, čiže také akože ako vám radím, alebo odporúčam. Tu som napríklad zoznam filmov nespravil ešte zatiaľ, takže raz, keď bude sa dať, tak spravím podobne, ako ste mali pre stredovek. No a tabuľky a ostatné veci. No a Family Tree of Monotheistic Religions Denominations, tak toto je riadna vec, čiže rodostrom, vierovyznaní, no a potom 30-ročnú vojnu zase na mape. Celkovo je to 5 strán, ale obsahovo je to dosť výrazné, ale myslím, že až toľko veľa roboty nebudete mať ako predtým ste mávali, ale aj tak to nespravíte za pár dní, takže treba si znovu rozvrhnúť čas. No a ja vám ten termín určím počas hodín, ale v podstate už teraz môžete pracovať, môžete si to rozvrhnúť, môžete na tom začať makať. Ja som vám síce hovoril, že vám sľúbim, že vám to doplním nejaké cvičenia, ale keď som si to pozeral zbežne, tak v podstate ani netreba, všetko je to OK. Dobre, takže poďme na to, si myslím, samozrejme pôjdeme po anglicky, no a ak budete mať nejaké otázky, pýtajte sa ďalej. Už by sme mali aj zmeniť, poprosím našu Sandru, nech nás zmení obrázok na nejaké zámorské alebo niečo také, no. Alebo humanisticko-renesančné. Dobre, takže let's start. Where to find notes that you need, you just go on with logical geography, with downloading notes, which are in chronological order, and when you finish Middle Ages, you just open the other part, which is early modern period. Among them, there should be 3 of them. Ottoman Empire, which is right now, I can open it. The other one is Renaissance in Humanism, another presentation. that I'm going to use. Then you have this Age of Discoveries, but as I said, I already prepared this presentation. And finally, eventually, that would be Reformation and Religious Wars. That would be all for now. Ďalšie zadanie potom budete mať samozrejme neskôr, ja som nazval revolúcie, to z takého tiež raného novoveku, alebo už vrcholnej, prvej fázy vrcholného novoveku, musí sa pozrieť, ako je tá periodizácia presne, lebo sa na tom teraz dohadujú historici v týchto obdobiach, poslednej dekáde dvoch. No a potom už pôjdeme na anglickú, americkú revolúciu, francúzsku revolúciu, to sú presne 3 témy pre toto obdobie. Pre 19. But let's talk about something we have in here, and that's Ottoman Empire. I have mentioned guys that we call the Ottoman Turks a couple of times, so I think this will be really a well-known thing for you. Actually, whole dynasty is different from Seljuk Turks that we have already mentioned when talking about Byzantine Empire, about Crusades. So these guys are called according to Guy, who's depicted his 19th century portrait. We don't know how it actually looked like, and his name was Osman the First. In Slovak you can pronounce it, it's perfect. I think that English speakers would be jealous that you can pronounce it in proper Turkish way, because S is very difficult consonant to pronounce for many nations, so they use this even Ottoman, OTH, Osman or Ottoman, and this was the name how it came to English language. That's why we derive and we distinct actually two Turkish nations, and one was the Seljuk Turks and the other the Ottoman Turks, according to him. Of course, there was probably very close relationship among them. I mean, connection, like in family, national tree of Turks, but they were not the same. Still, these guys and his army, they established their own state in late 13th century, really late because it's 1299, in northwestern Anatolia, in the city of Bursa. If you ever looked at the map, again, I can open the map. Sorry, still here we go on. So we need Google Map, of course, but Bursa is maybe surprisingly for many people who know what we are going to talk about, really very close to Istanbul, to Constantinople. If you imagine that at the time this was whole Byzantine Empire, that we know that how it ended up after the Crusades. So these territories were the Seljuk Turks, but even just like Arabic Caliphate, they fell under the attacks of Mongols. For a while, Byzantine Empire was restored. And in the middle of this period, here in the city of Bursa, in the middle of Byzantine territory, Osman established his Turkish emirate, because his title was Emir. So emirate is kind of like a duchy or principality. And he gradually started to grow and conquer new lands. And when he had enough in Anatolia, like somewhere in here, they just crossed the seas, not Constantinople, because it was too difficult to conquer, but they started attacking these territories in Thrace, in Greece, that were really weakened, attacking Bulgaria and Serbia, and even Anatolia. They clashed with Persians, with Iranians, so they turned their conquest even to Hungarian kingdom of Moldova and Wallachia, that is Romania nowadays. Only when they had been already fighting against Hungarian armies in here for decades, so they managed to conquer Constantinople and made it a brand new capital city of Ottoman Empire called Istanbul. So let's go through it. So they actually succeeded, the Seljuk Turks, Seljuk Sultanate, and as they were growing from emirs, they become sultans, which is title for the king or even maybe the emperor. They were Muslims, and because Arabic Caliphate got just dissolved and destroyed, and Ottomans later on conquest even the Middle East and even Saudi Arabia and even Egypt. So these Ottoman sultans took over the role of caliphs of Islam. Caliph, it means the head of all Arabs and all Muslims. Of course, Arabs were just subjected to Turks in these countries, but as I say, they were pretty tolerant concerning languages, despite we have very bad image about in our history as like one of the most evil things that came and invaded our lands. But who pay taxes? So they're okay with them. So, and they allow them even their religion, not only their language. This is possible. This is how it happened that Bulgarians, Greeks, Armenians, for a while until 20th century, they survived. Okay, as I said, they gradually became powerful state and conquered actually whole Byzantine Empire. They actually took over all the contributions of it, including administration, military, organization of the state, and many of the things. Of course, Hagia Sophia was rebuilt to the most. We'll come to that. Balkan states were occupied. Some of them were fighting fiercely, but they were influenced by Turks, just like Romanians or Bulgarians through this big Turkish community. The others were fighting even more, so Turks had to Muslimize them, Islamize them. It means to bring their religion because they had been fighting against them. So the only way for Turks how to control them was to force their religion for them. And that was case of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Albania that I shall again mention. Middle East and North Africa were pretty okay because Arabs, despite the Turks were different, didn't like them very much. But they were Muslims and they actually said peace. And for Arabs, it was finally positive for them that after years of wars, of terrible wars, they had actually peace. Of course, there were some regions where some sheikhs and emirs were rebelling against Ottoman Empire, just like in the books of Captain Batory Adventures by Juraj Červenák. But that was usually when they want to fight with Persia. Persia actually was never conquered, defeated by Ottoman Empire, and that was really only serious power that clashed them until Habsburg Empire seized power back again. But that would be after like a couple of centuries. What was the source of the power of Ottomans? They were actually, except this light cavalry that you've seen in here, but this is heavy cavalry and archers. That was this medieval army. Ottomans developed in this 14th century two types of army of troops that made them very different and very powerful. And I have already mentioned it while fighting Hungarian, our armies. First, that was army called Jeni or Yeni Seri. Yeni Cheri or Yeni Seri, it means like foreign army, like legion. In English we call it Janissaries, a po slovensky áno, viete, už ste počuli, sú tzv. Janičiari. Janičari, it means like foreign army, and that was infantry army that was recruited from Christian slaves and captives, usually boys, before some age of, let's say, 8 or 9, who were captured or sometimes given as a war tribute from conquered countries like from Romania, even from Hungary. And these guys, these kids, these boys, were brought up, raised up in military camps in Turkey by veterans, by Turkish Ottoman veterans, and they were brought up as very loyal Muslim and professional soldiers who were fighting with what you see they're holding with fire guns, with rifles or muskets. And this was very important because they're different from common people like Turkish soldiers who had to come back home to do in the farm, and take care of their family. These guys didn't have family, they had nothing, brainwashed, usually these like European Balkan people, boys who were like fanatic believers and very loyal to the Sultan and to their commanders. Excellent slave soldiers. Still, today when I ask Turks about this, so to teachers of history, because we had also this Comenius and Erasmus project, and we had also partner school from Turkey, and they said, but being Janissary, that was like a privilege, it was proud thing. So tell me how many Turks entered Janissaries? And he said, oh, I don't know. I said, nobody, because they're all like people who were actually captured, taken from their families. Just like in a famous poem by Samo Chalupka from period of Slovak Romanticism, Turčin Poničan, and village Poniky is when you go from Očova, Zvolenska, Slatina, up the river along Slatina, you come to Poniky, which is actually over the mountains near Banska Bystrica, very close. And that was place where Turks that did they raid, Ženajazdi. And in this poem, they during the first raid, they took also like kids and young girls to live in harems. But after years, the Turks they ran out of many other people. So next time they did raids, they also took people, they kidnapped people, even like older people, to help them in like homesteads and servants and so on. And one mother that she was stolen her baby boy. So after like 20 or 30 years later, or maybe 40 years later, another raid came, and even she, like old woman, she was kidnapped and she was brought to Ottoman Empire to Istanbul. And she took care of the kids of this Janissary, who was already a veteran. He had a family, he had right to get married. And one day he got shocked because he heard this slave woman singing a lullaby in Slovak language to his kids, to his children, to his baby. And he suddenly got a flashback from history that that was the song and that voice that her mother was singing, that his mother was singing to him, and that was him. And he got surprised that I'm your son, so voicing. So you know this very well, but it was actually nice story how these Janissaries were working. Still, it was professional army of shooters, mass shooters that could actually brawl down whole cavalry attack, could actually attack anybody, you know, in this way. And thanks to Janissaries, they were able to fight. The other thing, the other tower, these firearms, gunpowder. You cannot see it, but I just log this, but I can read it for you. So firearms was the thing that Turks actually uh, upgraded gunpowder weaponry from China and Korea to the mass use of muskets that are like, and these early modern late medieval guns or rifles, čiže pušky, muškety po slovensky, and cannons. Especially those cannons were important because they can make serious damage and they can bring down the walls. And if you can manipulate with them on the battlefield, it's easy. And in, let's say, Battle of Mohacs, our army was like 3 times smaller, but still the main difference was in this usage of firearms because our army had like barely some mosquitoes, while these Janissaries had like 20,000 of them. And cannons, we had like 20 small cannons, while Turks had 200 heavy cannons in here. So that was a really big difference that made Turks like really successful. Still, I pick up pictures from Otové Vojny sveta jednotka. We can see these Janissaries in more like realistic, not with some funny stuff, but during some procedures and ceremonies, they raise their caps, hats up, and also in this front part it's actually a spoon, and better spoon, golden spoon, was kind of like insignia of higher rank in the military, and they're also heroic deeds they had. Still, they used also like infantry, various types of shooters, as you can see their army marching and cannons in front of them. And still they had also heavy cavalry that were like sipahi, like heavy cavalry guys. So various types of military for them, and huge wars. So gradually conquest I'm going to tell you about started with this Burza around this northwestern Anatolia. As you can see in this yellow part, half of Anatolia, and but even large part of the Balkans. In the times when they conquered only Armenian lands in Anatolia, nowadays Turkey, they already invaded and occupied Bosnia, Serbia, and even Wallachia in Romania. So you see that was really big difference. Then they conquered also this Middle East and Egypt, North Africa, even these Arabic lands. And finally, when we had these big Turkish wars, as we call it, protiturecké vojny, in our history, that was time when they only conquered Iraq, these Arabic lands. And here they clashed with this Iranian, Persian Empire acquisition. So one by one, very quickly, you can just read it. So as I said, Byzantine Empire, still they were not able to bring down the walls of Constantinople. For during all this period, Constantinople was still free. As I told you, Armenians in Anatolia that were this dark blue. What's the color? Armenians were living there at that time. Then they attacked also Balkan Slavic kingdoms and also Greek kingdoms. Serbia fell after the very famous Battle of Kosovo Pole. Kosovo Pole, or Battle of Kosovo, in 1389 was actually first battle in European history with mass use of cannon artillery. Even Chinese, they still were using it only for fireworks, and they had a couple of guns, but not this typical like cannons as we know it. So Turks were the inventors of them. And here for Serbians, it was really big surprise, and the whole army just was brought down. Still interesting that it was the last battle in which Serbians had allies with very strange combination, if you know history of 20th century, because Croatian volunteers came from Hungary, then there were Bosniaks, the kingdom of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and from Albania. So Albanians, Croatians, Bosniak, Serbians fighting together against Ottoman Turks. All of them Christians and but medieval army. Only few of them survived, and at the end of the battle, one of them, Duke of Serbian, one of the Serbian domains, Miloš Obilić, surrendered, but Serbians, they never surrendered, and this was example that was followed later on by many Serbian soldiers and Yugoslavian soldiers, that he actually pretended as giving up, and he said, I'm going to confess to Islam, I'm going to still change the side. But because he was so high ranked nobleman, so he said that he want to confess to Islam only in front of the Sultan himself, Sultan Murad. That was important, very powerful one. So yeah, okay, they brought him there, but what did Miloš Obilić do? That he had a hidden knife somewhere in his belt, despite he was unarmed, of course. And when he was kneeling in front of him, he got a dagger and he stabbed him and killed Murad. Despite he knew he's going to be killed, of course. But that was the thing, that if they surrender, only to bring down their enemy and kill their hero. So that was also, and even Obilić was followed the name of football club, for example, and it became typical that Serbians never surrendered. Unfortunately for them, they would be occupied by Turks for almost 500 years. So that is also another thing. Still, Kosovo Pole today, whole region is called according to them, where Albanians during the history seized dominance, and that's why they were also with this civil war in Yugoslavia. It started in Kosovo, ended up in Kosovo, and Slovakia even today didn't accept. Actually, it's highly possible that Ivan Korčok with this, that they would maybe accept Kosovo as an independent country. Like 10 or 15 countries, including Slovakia, didn't do that from solidarity with Serbians. The other country soon after them was Bulgaria, and this famous Battle of Nikopol. I told you enough about how Sigismund of Luxembourg organized big crusade with our Hungarian army and even French, Burgundian heavy cavalry army. That during this siege, Murad II came to help them, and Sigismund Luxem barely saved his life. He had to jump to the Danube River, and he tried to swim to Venetian battleships that saved him, but all his army was gone, and it was big defeat. When he came back to Hungary, this weakening of his power was used by a couple of magnates that kidnapped him and tried to blackmail him, but you know how it ended up. The other countries north of Bulgaria were Romanian speaking, Wallachia and Moldova or Moldavia. You all also know these guys. And these countries are not conquered, but they were defeated so many times that they had to promise to be the vassals of Ottomans. It means that they would be allies of them. But being a vassal is not only ally, like we are friends, but it is that they were subjected to the Turks. They had to bow them, they had to pay them war tribute in silver and gold. They had to send them cattle and livestock, and even sometimes when Ottoman Sultan just decided that he needs more children, boys to Janissary armies. Let's say Wallachia had to send 5,000 boys, and of course Wallachian Romanian nobility had to pick them up and take them from their peasants, which of course caused a lot of rebellions and so on. And that's why one of the greatest heroes is Wallachian Duke Vlad Tepes. That was great commander of Wallachian armies against Ottomans, and even when he was defeated and he had to escape to Transylvania, to Hungary, where he was actually captured and imprisoned by Matthias Corvinus, our great king, and he died somewhere in prison. So people in Romania starting to tell stories about him because he was really cruel, and how to fight Ottomans, the best army ever in the history in the world of those times, was that he had to be really cruel, that Ottoman soldiers would scare of him, his armies. And that's why it was famous that he was impaling the prisoners, he was torturing them, killing them, And when he was feasting, having a dinner, while these Ottoman prisoners were being impaled. They say that actually the Turks started first. Turks claimed that Europeans had been doing that and they learned it only from Europeans, or they never did this. But the point is that his like bloodlusting passion from blood and torturing made him like really famous and demonic character while being a hero for Romanians themselves, and that made English or Scottish, I'm not sure, novelist and writer Bram Stoker, when he visited Austria-Hungary and he heard stories here in Slovakia and in Subcarpathian Rus about people who had to drink blood and they can turn into the bats called vampires that were well known, but here's her stories that people anywhere, your grannies are having these chestnut bounds, nuts, hidden, not hidden, but hang on in the next to the windows. And he asks, why do you have it? To protect from vampires. And he was shocked that still in Slovakia and Hungary, Kingdom of Hungary, people, peasants still believe in vampires. And he heard the stories in Romania where Romanians didn't have vampires in their mythology, but Slavic people they did. So he combined this belief in vampires with Vlad Tepes character, mixed them together in his famous novel Dracula. Much more sadder things happen in Bosnia and Albania because both of these countries were really warmongering, and in their mountains of Balkans they were fighting fiercely. So that's why Ottomans had to come with Islamization of the population. They managed to Islamize about 1/3 of population of Bosnia and Herzegovina that used to be Christian kingdom. Actually, the last one who was fighting against Ottoman Turks in the mid 15th century was King Turtko the First. So very funny name for us. But he was a great hero and the last ruler of Bosnia that used to be like strong medieval kingdom. Uh, Still, they were defeated. So 1/3 was Islamized. Until today, they are these Bosniak Muslims. Some part had influence from Catholic Hungarian Croatia, and that's why they were Catholics, more like Croatians. And the other influence came from Serbia, that was Eastern Orthodox Christian, and that's why even today's Bosnia and Herzegovina is divided in many enclaves that are either Muslim or Eastern Orthodox or Catholic. And that for that reason there was terrible and very sad civil war in the 1990s. That's when I was at your age was happening. Still Albanians, they were not Slavic, they were Illyrians and Albanians living during centuries within Byzantine Empire or being ruled by either Serbians, either Bulgarians, sometimes by even by this Bosnia Herzegovina or by Venice, for example. So at the time they were independent, and their leader was called Iskander. That is actually interesting because Iskander, it's Greek, not Greek, but Arabic version of name Alexander. Alexander. And Skander, it's actually this Albanian version of this mixture. So some guy, some Alex or Iskander, and Turks call him Beg. That's kind of a chieftain or a baron or a knight. So Iskander Beg or Skander Beg was leading Albanians in warfare, in partisan warfare against Ottomans. Finally, he died, like I believe, natural death. But still, even today, for Albanians, a great hero of their past. But he was the last one, and after that, Albanians completely confessed to turn to Muslim, and that's why they're the only real like Muslim country in Europe even today. Okay, enough of speaking. When I mention some of these guys, I have to mention Mehmed II. Mehmed II, he was sultan twice because once he was banished and had to go to his exile, but then he came back with the study coup d'etat, štátny prevrat, seized the power back. And he's called also the conqueror because during his rule, he managed to do a couple of things. Firstly, he had kind of a couple of decisive victories against our Hungarian armies. That was still in the times of before János Hunyadi came, and they even conquered Beograd. That was already Hungarian fortress. Then his expeditionary armies defeated also our Hungarian army expeditionary armies in Bulgaria, that we tried to deliberate those lands and even deliberate Bulgaria, and that was led by Vladislaus the First of Jagiellonian dynasty. This Jagiellonian. In this Battle of Varna in 1444, he fell. Our king fell. You know that it caused another civil war, Game of Thrones, here against Iskra, these Brethren armies and these Hunyadi armies. So that was the other one. But 4 years later, John Hunyadi had to fight not only Brethrens and Iskra of Jan Iskra in northern Hungary, Slovakia, but also had to fight Turks. But he was defeated for the second time at the Battle of Kosovo Pole. The only two defeats by John Hunyadi actually are only two famous battles for us, and that second Battle of Kosovo Pole where he was defeated, and Battle of Lučenec in 1451 that I was talking about is like 500 Brethren fighting against 12,000 Hunyadi's armies. So that was really good for Turks, of course. And final thing that he managed when he came back to the throne of Sultan was that he finally attacked Constantinople. By the time Turks had no technologies how to bring down these huge walls, still built by Romans during the times of Constantine the Great in the 4th century, when Constantinople became the new capital city of Roman Empire. And they did it because they constructed so many cannons and weapons, had enough ships, and even the siege of it was completely different. You can't see it, but in the presentation just opened this huge bombard, which is a huge cannon that is as big as me, perhaps. And it was one of the weapons used during this conquest of Constantinople. What is a paradox that this cannon was built by a Hungarian cannon maker and blacksmith with name Urban, and he brought it. He made it here in Hungary, brought it to Byzantine Empire and offered it to Byzantines, but Byzantines didn't have enough money to pay him, and because he spent so much time doing this, he said like it's not worth it. It's like I believe that I can pay me off with this, but I didn't have any money, so. He was angry. He got angry, and he offered this cannon to Mehmed II, and that was one of the things that he used to conquer and bring down the wall. So how the battle itself happened in 1453, and which is actually one of very important milestones of the end of Middle Ages and beginning of early modern period, is that they had to deal with the fortifications that were not only the biggest, hardest were from the land, that was easy to attack them, but you needed like cannons big like this, like 5 meters long and like 1.5 meter wide, with huge cannonballs. They had to be lifted with a special crane that was pulled by oxen, Jebiki. Still, they were like a bit weaker, but still fortification around the bay. And you know that they were crossed only once in history, and that was in 1204 by Crusaders, who had ships with besieging machines and falling bridges that could attack these fortification in from the sea. The other problem was that entrance to the weakest part of the bay was protected by a big chain that was under the sea level, but once when the enemy navy was approaching, so there were two big towers and they start to pull this chain above the sea level, so ships were just got shipwrecked on this chain. But that was another thing that from here on the other side, there were mountains, as you can see, and mountains like this. And Mehmed got a plan that he had so big armies with so many things. So he used this Viking style of pulling ships on the bank, on the beach, and bringing a lot of wood and using like hundreds of oxen, just a stoky biko, and also thousands of slaves and even janissaries and soldiers. They start to pull these ships, rolling on the trunks of the trees up the steep hills in Constantinople. This is really huge, and this extreme logistic operation, unbelievable for that time, was also the evidence of the skills and abilities of Ottoman military. So when they actually transported and pulled these ships over the mountains, and they landed again in this Golden Horn Bay, they called Golden Horn, they could attack and embank on the other side with weak fortification. One attack thus led from one side. Main attack was on these main gates of the biggest fortification, and that was the thing. Actually, Byzantines living in this Constantinople for maybe like 100 years already, besieged by enemies, were all the time supplied from sea. And what was funny thing, they were helped from Spain, at that time growing Castile, Kingdom of Castile, but also from Venice and Genoa. If you remember, these actually Venetians were those who attacked Constantinople in 1204. So maybe that was kind of payback, maybe like cleansing, purifying their karma. But Venetians, Genoese, their enemies, and also Spanish volunteers, Castilian mercenaries were helping. Together, there was no more than 10,000 soldiers in big city of population of 100,000 people. So they didn't have enough men. And when they came here, that was about 80,000 Turkish soldiers who attacked the main gates. As you can see, even these heavy cannons attacking, bringing down walls. Once they made a hole, so hordes of Ottoman army soldiers, Janissaries, entered the city. Then they attacked it from this Golden Horn Bay and from both sides. So this is famous painting of Mehmed II, the conqueror, Mehmed Dobyvatel, entering the city. Actually, here there are people lying. You can recognize some uniforms of the Spanish soldiers, but also that bishop, for example. And he's bringing this crescent of Islam and changing capital city, Constantinople, once Byzantine Empire, to Istanbul. And thus Turks took over great Byzantine Empire that lasted for more than 1,000 years. But they, Byzantines, Eastern Romans, still counted beginnings from ancient Rome, even this including Western Rome. So once great empire. But Turks, as I said, took over many of the uh, things that Byzantines used. Among them, apart from administration and military, was also the biggest Christian temple of the world that they changed in the biggest Muslim mosque of the world. They just exchanged crosses for crescents, and they built big minarets in here. Still, this building is standing, which is incredible because it was built in 4th century in the times of Constantine the Great, and still standing. But because of mm, even Turks were afraid whether visiting and using it for praying, and thousands of people entering, so they reconstructed it in 19th century, stopped using it as the mosque, and in 20th century it became just a museum. What is interesting, you can see Arabic writings because Turks were using Arabic language and script for praying in Islam. They didn't use Turkish language. They changed it only like in 20th century, 1920s, by Mustafa Kemal. But last time Erdogan, president of Turkey, so he claimed that they are going to change this mosque, this Hagia Sophia, famous temple for both cultures, both worldwide religions, back to mosque, which angered many Christians, but you see it's there, so it just come back to their previous original thing. Of course, no chance, despite Greeks believe were dreaming in 1920s during the First World War that Ottoman Empire dissolved into Turkey, but many lands got independence, so they believed that maybe in 19th century a couple of times Russians in fight against Ottomans, they approach and almost attack Istanbul, and that was a high chance that they can actually banish Turks from this town and give it back to Greeks, for example, to Byzantine Empire. Okay, what else? The other sultan that I mentioned is Suleiman the Magnificent, Suleiman Nadherni, very popular sultan in Turkey. They made even soap opera about him, called Sultan. For us, was the worst guy ever. For them, it was the best guy ever because Ottoman Empire experienced golden age of their empire. They call him not only the Magnificent, they call him also the lawgiver because one of the things he did that he introduced new and very modern law code that at that time in Europe we couldn't compare. There were many things that actually all people were free. They were not people who were subjects like here in Hungary. Podani nevolnici. They didn't have it. Only free peasants, they had to pay taxes, but that was all. And in case they, for example, conquered this Bulgaria, Serbia, or Greece, and even in Istanbul, people who were Christians, who were So many of them were killed, but many people came back and they settled down. And even in Istanbul, even Christians or Jews could live if you paid taxes. That was okay. So they were pretty tolerant, and that was thanks to this law code. That happened during these Habsburg or Hungarian Turkish wars that you are actually looking for these legends, but many peasants from this like fighting zone, war zone, were escaping not to the north but to the south, to Ottoman territories, because it was much easier to live under the Ottoman oppression than under Hungarian, our Habsburg oppression. Here you were forced to pay higher taxes. You were forced to work on the Dominical, on the landlord's land, and even you were usually forced to accept different religion, because at the time, that was period of Reformation, there were many wars between Catholics and Protestants, and even Eastern Orthodox people in Ukraine and Subcarpathian regions were forced to be Catholics. But here in Ottoman Empire it was okay. So that for that time, keep in mind, and actually, for example, American history books for schools, they really admire this Mongol Khanate, but even this Ottoman Empire for these reasons, that it was multicultural empire and people there were not so bad in this way. Later on, of course, it was changing. Still, he was most famous for his victories above us, about Hungary, because during his rule, our kingdom was destroyed. What happened? Firstly, in 1521, he conquered Belgrade for like fifth or sixth time again, but finally, in Belgrade would be occupied for about like 200 years approximately. In Battle of Mohács, he was the one who defeated our armies and very quickly invaded the Buddha. Then in 1540s, he came back. But while the time he tried to break down also the power of rising Austria and Habsburgs, because at the time Habsburgs were claiming the throne of the defeated Hungary, and they wanted to support their opponents, János Zápolyi, Jan Zápolsky. So let's like just march there. And because they were so powerful, so strong, so when we marched to Hungary, why not to conquer Austria immediately? So 200,000 men army with a lot of cannons that had not only marched again across Hungary in 1529, but they actually entered Austria and they start to siege in 1529. We call it the first siege of Vienna, the first battle, because there will be the other one, and both of them were unsuccessful for them. So despite Magnificent and Lawgiver was successful, that was his defeat, because while they marched, they actually underestimated weather in Europe, in Central Europe, and especially the period when at the time it was getting much colder. Like we have this global warming at that time, that was global colding. We called it like small ice age of early modern period. And that caused, when they came there, it was already October. And you know that here in Štiavnica, in October, sometimes it is snowing. And it was snowing in near Vienna. So suddenly soldiers from Middle East, from Northern Africa got frozen, camels, not used to these conditions. So also in these bad hygiene conditions, that they were just besieging Vienna, they didn't have enough supplies, despite they were sending their vassals from Wallachia and Tatars from Crimea to Slovakia. First time we met with them, like with Tatars, again with Mongols. So they start to suffer with dysentery and some flus, and the epidemic. So many of them just died because of diseases, and they had to like withdraw back to the Ottoman Empire. Second Battle of Vienna would be again bad for Turks, but that would come much later in 1684. But I come to that too. Uh, when they realized that Jan Zapolsky wouldn't claim the throne, and when he saw also this campaign, and when he realized the Turks, despite being great rulers in their own lands, but all the lands that were neighboring with them, so Turks very often just plundered. They did raids. They were signing like warning letters, like pay us ransom, otherwise we shall kill all your kids, take them to slavery, and we will rape your women and your filthy Christian dogs. And actually, they were doing that. Despite Turks don't believe it today, the historiography is of course quiet about it, but we know that it was really terrible to live. Like Slovaks really suffered, in this period. So when he realized that he actually invited and he allowed to bring these Turks to his kingdom, so he gave up and he gave throne and rule in Hungary to Ferdinand. So this is the way that Habsburg overruled Hungary, which Turks actually didn't want to do that. They wanted Hungary to be the vassal, just like Wallachia, Moldavia. So they made another invasion, during which they finally occupied Buda, the capital of Hungary, in 1541, and for upcoming 150 years they occupied all Hungarian Danubian basin. Now the only part of Hungary that remained independent, not independent but under the Habsburg rule, were Slovakia and Western Hungary and Western Croatia. Eastern part, Transylvania and Subcarpathian Rus, and even part of Eastern Slovakia with Košice, for example, became like Transylvania and rebelling state against Habsburgs. So officially it was part of Hungary, but very often fighting against Habsburgs. And because they were Protestants and Eastern Orthodox, they hated them more than Muslims, so very often they were like vassals of Ottoman Empire. And when I tell you about uprisings, rebellions of Gábor Betlen, of Imre Tekeli, of George Rákóczi, of Ferenc Rákóczi II, all of them relied on the help from Turks. And every time when there was a big uprising, there was invasion of Ottoman countries in here. And Slovakia was just in the middle, because once when you want to fight Habsburgs, you have to cross Slovakia, not Ottoman territories. When Ottomans are coming to help them, crossing Slovakia. When Habsburgs fighting Turks or fighting rebels in Transylvania, so they had to march Slovakia. And even Habsburgs are not like cool guys, because they're raping, stealing, taking food from people. So three armies for 150 years fighting in here. So occupation of Danubian basin by this great Suleiman the Magnificent, but for us one of the worst period of the history. Only Second World War probably was worse than this. If you could mention that, yeah, come on, but Mongols were like very bad, but it was only 1 year they spent it here. Turks were here in southern Slovakia, Levice, Filiakovo, Komárno, for like 150 years. And all the time these villages were plundered, just like Poniky and many others. Budeme o tom hovoriť viac počas tých našich dejín. So this is the thing, the map, how was the extent, the furthest territorial extent of Ottoman Empire. I told you everything about here. Even here, this is actually Nové Zámky, Nitra, actually very close to Žarnovice, Levice being occupied, Muráň in here. As you see that they divided Hungary of Habsburgs and Transylvania, Sedmohradsko. When Turks couldn't proceed further on, so they started attacking these Ukrainian lands and former Mongolian Khanates. And here, the Khanate of Crimea, these Mongols or Crimean Tatars, became very important vassals for Turks. And here they start to clash with Cossacks, with Ukraine. Cossacks, I told you about these wars and this letter that they wrote back to Ottoman Sultan. And here, together with Poland, Lithuania, they led many heroic battles. Pan Volodiyovsky for his famous novel by Henrik Sienkiewicz and Adam Mickiewicz, many of them Ogniem i Mieczem, by fire and sword. Great adventure stories, how Poles, Lithuanians and Ukrainian Cossacks were fighting against Ottoman Turks. That's why also in 1683, when Turks organized another second siege of Vienna, Poland-Lithuanian Union would be the main army to come to help Austrians and our armies, and that would be decisive victory for them and ultimate decline. So what happened? After many years, Europeans had to change a lot with changing their navy, changing their military to actually challenge Turks. And that happened for the first time in the battle that was in the sea, Battle of Lepanto in Western Mediterranean near Italy, where combined navies of Spain, of the Kingdom of Spain, of Portugal, of Kingdom of Naples, okay, the Sicilian kingdom, and Papal State with their armies. So together, I forgot about Maltese Knights. Čiže vidíte, že ak by som preskočil stredovek, tak vôbec nepoznáte nikoho z týchto. And we will actually talk about Castilla and Spain again, but here in the Battle of Lepanto, this Christian navy was able to defeat and sunk Ottomans. That was very bad for them, because they had plans to invade the Habsburg lands in Spain and Austria and Italy from the south, and suddenly they had dominance only in Eastern Mediterranean. Even this was not so important. I forgot about one country, Republic of Venice was there, of course, and Venetians used this victory of Lepanto. They start attacking their ships. Ottomans, they were not so strong in the seas anymore, and they start to invade islands in Aegean Sea, Greek islands, Rhodos, for example, in even Cyprus, or Crete. And they were actually deliberated by the nations, but only in the seas. In the land, they were still undefeatable until another 1 century came and the Second Battle of Vienna in 1683. I will tell you a lot about this battle, but during the history of these Habsburgs, Austrian land, čiže toto budeme preberať po slovensky, tento veľké obrovské bitke pri Viedni, kde spojené armády Rakúšanov, Nemcov, rôznych žoldnierov z celej Európy a hlavne príchod poľsko-litovskej armády v podstate zničil ďalšiu 200 000 osmanskú armádu a zaznamenal vlastne koniec. So that was the thing. Now Turks were being expelled from Kingdom of Hungary by 1699 until the Peace of Karlovac in Croatia. In 1721, Beograd was deliberated, but that was the end from Habsburg sides. And they were okay with the Ottoman still having these Balkan lands. So Serbians, Bulgarians, Greeks were still occupied by them. That was used by rising power of Russia. Russian Tsardom actually expanded in Ukraine in this Crimean Khanate during Peter the Great, and they realized that actually helping their Eastern Orthodox brothers, because they had the same confession, religion, would be excellent for them as bringing power to the Black Sea and maybe even to Byzantine Empire. So Russians had a dream that one day their navy and Russian army will deliberate Balkan, Slavic, Eastern Orthodox countries and even restore Byzantine Empire, because that was the source of Eastern Orthodox religion in Russia, that was from Constantinople, from Cyril and Methodius, but they were Greeks, they were Byzantines. So they had a dream, and a couple of times they actually managed to come to these lands and they expanded. So in 19th century, maybe I should add it, this 19th century, Russians expanded to Black Sea and Austrians in the Balkans. And in 19th century, it appeared that Ottomans didn't evolve, didn't have Enlightenment period, didn't have Industrial Revolution, and that caused that many weak sultans, rulers, didn't care about ruling the country. So Janissaries had still having this privileged position in society, started to revolt. And it was real troublesome times for them, so started decline this 19th century, which finally caused them in the First World War, World War One. In here, they were defeated, and not defeated like they were invaded, but actually their empire just got dissolute, just like Austria-Hungary from inside. That rebelling nations like Arabs, Greeks, Armenians started to fight, and within their country, just like in Austria and Hungary, there were revolutions, which in this case, Mustafa Kemal, lieutenant colonel of Turkish army, Ottoman army, pulled down the last sultan and proclaimed the Republic of Turkey in 1921. So that was the end of the Ottoman Empire that we have it. Bonus task is not for you anymore, but maybe for yourselves. You can just think, so what were the direct results of Ottoman occupation of southeastern Europe, with Muslimization and Islamization, and also changing the nations, because later Serbians and Bulgarians and Greeks started to fight each other in Balkan wars and actually starting up First World War. How did it affect religious structure in the Balkans? And that is the answer is in the civil war of Yugoslavia, or in the case of Albanians today. And the other point is for humanism and Renaissance, the next topic, and after the Age of Discoveries, because how did monopoly trade of Ottoman Turks with Asia affect Western Europe? What do I mean, guys? When Turks occupy the Suez Channel and the Silk Road, they start to ask so high taxes for importing porcelain from China, silk from China, spices from Indonesia, diamonds from India, that Europeans couldn't afford them. So the trade between Asia and Europe was interrupted. That made countries in Western Europe who had been like famous navigators, like Spain and Portugal, but later on even England, France, for example, or Netherlands, to discover new lands and try to get to Asia around Africa. They didn't know where it is the end of Africa, but maybe very close. Some of them, like Columbus, believe that it's on the other side of this sea because it's a globe. So this is actually one of the results for them. Prezentácia veľmi stará, 2005, vidíte, čiže aj toto je história detská. No a pozriem sa, koľko času ja ešte mám, že či sa mi oplatí a neoplatí sa mi začínať tému. Čiže dnešná hodina bola len čisto o Osmanskej ríši, čiže som rád, že som to akurát stihol. Kto prišiel neskôr, kto si zapol takže neskôr alebo posunul, tak na začiatku som vám dal inštrukcie na zadanie. Termín ešte nie je stanovený, ale minimálny mesiac na to dostanete, pretože ďalšiu tému Humanix renesancie bude možno tiež na celú hodinu, uvidíme. Age of Discoveries možno aj na 2 hodiny a tie náboženské vojny možno aj na 3 vyučovacie hodiny. No určite však to bude február, niekedy v marci predpokladám, že vám dám ten termín. Dobre? Ale pracujte na tom, nech toho nemáte veľa, nech to bez problémov zvládnete. No a v podstate ešte by som mal rozprávať 12 sekúnd, aby som si to krásne. Takže ja vám len prajem, decká, pekný deň. Nezabudnite odpovedať na otázky, ktoré tam máte. No a stay positive in mind and negative in your test. Bye bye.